The sky above Bitterpine Range hung, heavy with the weight of a summer storm that had come and gone in the space of a few brutal hours, leaving the highland, wood-soaked, tangled, and treacherous somewhere deep within that vast, jagged wilderness. A small girl's voice had long since stopped calling for help. Ellie Morgan was 9 years old, barefoot, scratched, dehydrated, and alone. It had been 2 nights since the accident. One moment she had been sitting in the back seat of the family's SUV, drowsy from trail mix and sunburn, and the next screaming as the vehicle slid sideways down the mountain road, tires screeching against wet gravel. Her mother's voice, her father's arms trying to shield her. Then darkness. They crashed deep off-road into a dry ravine no map ever mentioned. Her parents were alive but badly hurt. Her father could barely move, slurring words and coughing blood. Her mother had pressed a flashlight and emergency whistle into Ellie's trembling hands, whispering what no child should ever hear. Go get help, you're faster than the dark. She went through the shattered trees and narrow deer paths. She ran, her knees buckling, her breath breaking, her heartbeat roaring louder than the storm. But Bitterpine Range was merciless, and wide hours past days blurred. The whistle was lost somewhere in a tumble down a rocky slope. The flashlight died. So did the strength in her legs. By the time she collapsed beside a split-barked pine tree, its gnarled roots exposed like bones in the earth, Ellie couldn't remember the last time she'd had water. Her lips cracked, her head buzzed with heat, and her small body trembled uncontrollably, not just from cold, but from the kind of fear that rewired something deep and quiet inside a person, the kind that had no name, only silence. It was that silence she fell into now. She didn't see the eyes at first, didn't hear the breath, soft rustle of paws over soil. It wasn't until a low, almost imperceptible growl laced through the underbrush that her eyes cracked open. Barely what she saw should have made her scream. Half a dozen wolves stood around her, not just passing through, not on the hunt. They had formed a half circle, silent, alert, unmoving. Their fur shifted slightly with the wind, ears perked, tails still, but none advanced, none retreated. They watched, waiting. Ellie blinked, uncertain if she was dreaming. Her body wouldn't respond. She tried to lift her arm, but only her fingers twitched. Her throat burned when she tried to call for help, and no sound came out, just a rasp of breath and the tightness of fear constricting her chest like vines. Then he stepped forward. The wolf that led them, he was massive with silver gray fur layered like weathered stone, and eyes the color of sunlit amber. A faint scar cut diagonally above one eye, a healed wound not from age but battle. This was not a creature of weakness. He exuded something deeper, older, something that made her pulse slow despite the terror. Ash, she didn't know why that name came into her mind, only that it felt right, like she wasn't naming him, she was remembering him. Ash moved closer, each step so deliberate felt like a question. His nose twitched, he lowered his head, sniffed near her feet, then her torn jacket, then finally so close she could feel the brush of his fur. His muzzle met her lips, not to bite, not to growl, but to breathe. A sudden cooling sensation touched her mouth, moisture, water. Her cracked lips absorbed it instinctively, what little still clung to the thick fur around his muzzle. She couldn't understand how, but it tasted faintly of spring water, and when she opened her eyes fully, she saw the wet sheen on his face. He had drunk and then come back to give her this. A few seconds passed before he pulled away, head lifting once more. Another wolf, smaller, darker, stepped forward and did the same. Then another, not all, but enough to dampen her lips, to stretch the fragile thread of life just a little farther through the night. When darkness thickened again and the temperature dropped abrupt and cruel, as it always did in the mountains, they surrounded her. No howling, no movement beyond slow, deliberate shifting. The wolves lay down beside her, pressed their bodies against hers. Fur met skin, warmth met fear, and held it back. She didn't sleep so much as drift in and out, floating on warmth and the strange rhythm of breath from wild Hearts at some point she opened her eyes again and saw, as still awake he was, lying just inches from her face head, raised eyes scanning the forest with quiet vigilance. She didn't feel scared anymore. She should have, but something in the way he held his gaze not on her, but over her, felt like the thing her mother had done. In the car, the protective thing to stay. Alive for them thing by dawn mist, crawled along the forest floor like a thin white-tide. Ellie awoke slowly, body aching, but the warmth around her hadn't left. The wolves were still there too, had risen and stood watch at a distance, while the others stirred but stayed near. Ash remained beside her. She didn't know what this was, why it was happening. She only knew one truth, the kind that doesn't need proof when it's carved into your bones. They hadn't left her, and something told her they wouldn't. The sun rose slowly behind the jagged ridgeo, lines casting long shadows through the pine trunks and dousing the forest in amber light. The air held a quiet hush, that early stillness found only in places far removed from roads and rooftops. In morning alarms, Ellie blinked into the light, the stiffness in her neck and shoulders a dull reminder that she was still alive and still here. She moved her hand slowly, as if unsure it still belonged to her. It scraped over damp pine needles. A second later, the warmth pressed against her side, shifted. She turned her head, and there he was, Ash, lifting his muzzle from the forest floor, ears twitching, eyes sharp and ancient as ever. The others had begun to rise. One stretched out long limbs and yawned wide, revealing teeth as white as frost. Another padded silently toward the edge of the clearing to sniff the wind. They hadn't left her, not during the night, not now. The morning was still cold enough to bite, but the heat from their bodies had pushed back the worst of it, and Ellie could feel a little strength returning. Her legs ached, her throat still burned, but she no longer felt the edge of panic humming beneath her skin. She sat up slowly, her arms trembling under her own weight, and glanced down at her shirt, still torn at the sleeve from when she'd tripped on the rock stained with dirt and blood, but still hers. Her body hurt, but it worked. That was something. Ash remained beside her, watching. "I don't know what you are," she said, her voice so hoarse it barely came out, "but I think you saved me." He didn't move, just watched, quiet and unreadable. He wasn't the kind of animal that did tricks or barked or begged. He didn't lick faces or wag tails. He wasn't a dog. Ellie knew that now. There was a depth to him, something ancient in his bones that made him feel less like a pet and more like a sentinel, like something that had always been here, long before she was born, long before roads and cities and all the things humans thought they'd tamed. She tried to stand, her knees buckled immediately, and she collapsed onto the ground again with a soft cry. The younger wolves shifted at the sound, but Ash only turned his head. He stepped closer, lowered his body just enough that his side touched her arm, and stood steady. She looked at him. He looked back, and this time she understood it wasn't just about comfort. It was permission and offer. Ellie pressed a hand to his thick coat, hesitated, then pushed herself up again, using his body as a brace. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He held steady until she was on her feet, wobbling but standing. Her breath came fast, not from fear, but all. Then, without a sound, Ash turned and began walking, not away, forward into the trees, a slow, deliberate pace. He looked over his shoulder only once. Ellie understood that, too, he wanted her to follow, step by aching step. She did. The other wolves moved with them, not surrounding her now, but guiding the path forward. Sometimes one would dart ahead, sniff the ground, then return. One broke off entirely and vanished through the underbrush, reappearing minutes later on a rise just ahead, as if scouting the trail. Ellie didn't know where they were taking her, but she trusted them, not because it made sense, but because it felt right in a way nothing else had. Since the crash, by midday the heat returned, not the crushing weight of the sun she remembered from the first day, but enough to make her limbs heavy and her lips dry. Again she stumbled, catching herself on a low branch, her vision momentarily Swimming, she was running out of strength. Again, as stopped, he lifted his head and sniffed the air, then trotted forward, faster than before the others followed. His lead and Ellie groaning through. Exhaustion pushed herself after them. They brought her to a stream clear, shallow, cold, tumbling over stones like. Laughter, Ellie dropped to her knees in the mud and drank greedily with both hands, water spilling through her fingers. And down her chin, it was the most glorious thing she'd ever tasted. When she had enough to stop the dizziness and burning in her throat, she looked up and saw Ash watching her again, always watching a few feet away. The others had started to drink too, lapping the water in silence. The sun filtered through the pine canopy, dappling the forest floor in shifting gold. They rested there for a long while Ellie dozed against a tree trunk, her hand curled in the dirt, her head against her arm. When she woke, Ash was lying beside her, not close, not touching, but near enough that she could hear his breath and feel the weight of his presence, a kind of anchor. That afternoon, they began walking. Again, always deeper, never back somewhere. Along the way, Ellie lost track of time. The forest felt bigger than it had before, older, more alive. At times they passed old stones carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Weathered tree stumps split like bone. Clearings where the light seemed almost too still. Once they passed a large tree with a wide gash down its bark, old and deep and scarred. As stopped there, he sniffed at it, then looked at her. Something about that pause made the hair on the back of her neck rise. She didn't understand it, but she remembered it. She reached out and placed her palm against the scar. It was cold. Ash moved on. The sun was beginning to dip low when Ellie saw something that made her knees weaken, not from exhaustion this time, but from something closer to disbelief. A tent, or what used to be one, torn at the seams, half collapsed under a mossy log, but unmistakably human. And just beyond that, planks would stacked in a forgotten campfire, ring metal cans rusted into the dirt, an old thermos tipped on its side. Someone had once stayed here. Ellie's heart skipped. Ash padded slowly around the clearing, sniffing the edges, checking the wind. Then he came back and sat beside her. She looked up at him, blinking away sudden tears. I think you're trying to take me somewhere safe. He said nothing, of course, but the way he remained beside her, solid, silent, patient, told her everything. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't random instinct or animal curiosity. It was choice. And somewhere between the pine trees and the stillness of the stream, between the warmth of his fur and the water on her lips, between the unspoken pauses and the places he'd led her to, something had formed between them. Not friendship, something older, something unbreakable, a pact not made with words, but in breath and warmth and survival. As the stars began to prick the sky overhead and the wolves bedded down around her once more, Ellie curled close to Ash, her fingers wrapped in the thick fur of his neck. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing with every part of her that still remembered fear. She was no longer alone. The forest had grown quieter, not with the silence of absence, but with the stillness that comes when something is listening. Ellie noticed at the moment she woke, curled into the base of the collapsed tent, her fingers still tangled in Ash's fur. The air felt tighter somehow. The pines taller, the light thinner, and though her body had begun to mend from exhaustion and dehydration, something in her gut told her the woods were changing, no longer just a refuge, but a threshold. Ash stood before the others, stirred. His ears were sharp, his head slightly lifted, sensing something the girl couldn't feel. His movements had shifted to less like a wanderer, more like a guardian on alert. He turned once to look at her, his eyes scanning her face as if checking her for breaks or bruises, and moved off with the same silence that had become second nature. The others followed, shadows with breath and muscle weaving between trunks with effortless grace. Ellie rose more slowly, her legs still act from the long trek, but there was more control in her body. Now she was learning how to move in this world how. To match her rhythm to theirs she drank. From the stream nearby washed her arms, and followed Ashton lead her on the same kind of path they'd taken before. This time it was steeper up over slick, rock and gnarled roots through terrain that felt forgotten even by the wilderness at times he paused nose to, the wind as if reading messages in air. Currents Ellie could never hope to. Interpret she didn't ask, questions not. Allowed her presence had already become a quiet agreement she would trust him and he would lead hours past like that in silence and motion. Eventually the trees gave way to granite, a sharp gray expanse, veined with ancient scars. At the center of it all stood a single standing pine, roots exposed like fingers reaching into nothing, branches crooked from years of wind, and at the base of the pine a body as slowed the other wolves fanned out, forming a slow, circling perimeter. Ellie approached the figure carefully. Her breath caught it. Was a man mid-30s, maybe older, though his face was so bruised and swollen it was hard to tell. His clothes were torn and dirty, his lips cracked. He was breathing, but only barely. A half unzipped pack lay beside him, the insignia stitched onto its side made Ellie freeze. National Wildlife Authority, her father had worked for them once. The sight of the patch sent a ripple of memory through her spine. Her father coming home in uniform, boots muddy, a wolf sticker peeling off the back window of his truck. Ellie knelt beside the man, placing 2 fingers against his wrist. The pulse was faint, but there she didn't recognize him. But Ash had brought her here for a reason. She looked up, searching the wolf's face for some sign. Ash didn't move, but in his stillness was a weight of intention. As she understood now, this wasn't about her anymore. It was about someone else. Ellie dug through the man's pack. A first aid kit, shattered protein bars, a flare gun with 1 shot left. Most importantly, a satellite tracker, its screen blinking, low battery, but still functional. She stared at it. The red pulsing on the map marked their location. She didn't know how to use it to call for help, but someone would be tracking him if she could just keep him alive long enough. Ellie worked with what she had, cleaned the wounds with stream water, bandaged where she could. Ash stayed close, watching her hands, his breath slow, and even hours passed. A man stirred once, mumbling nonsense, feverish and disoriented, but didn't wake. The sun was slipping low again. Ellie felt the cold creeping into the stone she looked at. Ash, I can't do this alone, she whispered. I need help. And Ash moved. He trotted to the edge of the clearing, lifted his head, and howled. The sound ripped through the trees like it didn't belong to this world, rising and falling with an ancient weight that made Ellie's skin rise. It wasn't just noise, it was a summons from deep in the woods. Other voices answered. The wolves were calling back. Moments later, Ash vanished into the trees. Ellie blinked after him, heart pounding. She didn't know what he was doing. She just knew she had to wait. Night fell. The man moaned in his sleep, shifting weakly. Ellie built a small fire with twigs and dry moss, careful to keep it low. The wolves returned before dawn. Not all of them, just Ash and 2 younger ones, but they weren't alone. One of them carried something tied with a strip of nylon, a walkie-talkie. Ellie stared. Ash dropped it at her feet. She picked it up with trembling hands. Static at first and a broken voice. Search zone 4, still no signal. Copy. She pressed the button. Hello, someone's here. A man hurt. He's got a tracker, please. The voice crackled back sharper. Now say. Again, a man with a tracker. Ellie's voice broke. Yes, he's breathing, but he's bad. Please hurry. They gave her instructions. She gave them the coordinates. The signal held by the time the sun climbed over the mountains. The sound of a helicopter split the sky. The wolves vanished into the trees the moment the noise started. Ellie crouched beside the man until boots hit the ground. Paramedics rushed and questions flew. She answered what she could. They didn't ask why. A girl was alone in the forest. Not then. Not yet. But one medic paused when he found the claw marks in the dirt. The huge paw prints circling the granite. You weren't alone out here, were you? He said quietly. Ellie didn't answer. She just looked toward the tree and where Golden. Eyes watched from the shadows, and she nodded once slow. Ash watched her until the rotor blades drowned everything out. Then he turned and vanished into the woods again. The questions came first from the medics, from the officers at the ranger station, and later from the press when word got out that a missing conservation agent had been found barely alive in the middle of nowhere by a 9-year-old girl, with no phone, no map, and no logical explanation as to how she'd gotten there. Or survived, but Ellie didn't have answers. They could understand, not the kind they wanted. They asked how she found the man. She said a wolf led her. They asked how she survived 4 nights in the wilderness. She told them the pack kept her warm. They asked what had happened to the rangers' satellite signal. She didn't know. She just knew it was broken like the man, and somehow Ash had brought her to him before time ran out. Most people didn't believe her at first. They smiled, politely called her brave, said she must be confused or lucky or maybe hallucinating, but some didn't smile. Some leaned and listened a little harder, heard the steadiness in her voice, the lack of fantasy in how she told the story. A few of them began to wonder, and one of them, a ranger named Cole Barrett, did more than wonder. He was quiet, observant, the kind of man who didn't waste words or time. When the press left and the station emptied, he came and sat beside Ellie while she waited for her mother to arrive from Portland. He didn't ask the usual questions. Instead, he showed her a faded photo from a file of black and white image of a wolf, massive, battle-worn, with pale amber eyes and a dark streak down his back. This the one? He asked. Ellie looked at it, then nodded without hesitation. That's Ash. Barrett didn't react, not at first. Then he sat back and whistled low. Thought he was just a story, he muttered. Some say he was a military dog left behind. Others say he's pure wild, never once touched a leash. Last real sighting was 5 years ago, Northridge. Nobody ever caught him, but folks say he shows up when things go bad, storms, accidents, fires. Ellie didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Barrett shook his head. Well, kid, I think you just gave us the first proof he's real. The ranger who had been rescued, Agent Grant Lewis, woke 2 days later in the hospital. His voice was weak, but his memories were sharp. He remembered the ambush, the stolen files, and the blow to the head that had left him for dead. But what he remembered most wasn't the pain or the cold. It was the feeling of something large and warm pressed against his side in the night, of breath not human, but calm and steady, keeping him tethered to life. He asked about the girl when they told him her name. He smiled faintly. She saved my life, he said, but she wasn't alone. When they showed him photos of the rescue, he stopped at one nod of Ellie or the medics, but a blurred background shot taken from a body cam just beyond the frame of the scene. A pair of eyes in the shadows, pale. Watching. That's him, he said. That's the one who stayed with me. The story changed after that, not in the headlines. They still said miracle rescuing girl, found hero in woods, but in the spaces between conversations and the lowered voices of rangers and researchers, in the quiet nods exchanged by those who had once dismissed the old stories about the wolf they called Ash. Ellie returned home, but something had shifted. At night, she'd sit on the porch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders and watch the tree, and listening for sounds she now understood weren't just wind or birds. She missed him, not like someone misses a pet, but like you miss a part of yourself that had gone walking ahead of you and maybe wouldn't come back. Her mother tried to return them to normal life, school, piano lessons, rules about bedtime, but Ellie had changed, and though she never acted out, never raised her voice, there was a quiet defiance to her now, like the woods had woven something into her bones. Then came the call from Ranger Barrett. He asked to see her, said there was something she should hear. They met at the base of Wild Pine Ridge, where Barrett had set up a temporary observation post. He handed her a pair of headphones and pressed play on a recorder. Picked this up yesterday morning, he Said Ellie listened at first, just wind, then the rustle of movement too soft for her. Human steps too heavy for dear low. Distant howl rose and faded then came. The sound of hooves and voices, two men, talking in clipped tones, one of them. Angry, you said the kid wouldn't make it. That far she shouldn't have I cut the fuel line. She had no water, no food she. Still found him at the feds connect us. To that ranger's files Barrett stopped. The recording these guys are real he. Said Grant was investigating illegal. Land deals he had names, dates, and someone wanted him out of the way only. They didn't count on a little girl in A. Wolf showing up in time. He looked at Ellie, you ready to go back? She nodded. The hike back up the ridge wasn't easy. But this time Ellie let her feet knew. The way when they reached the overlook. The valley stretched wide and empty. The wind carried the scent of pine and snow. Melt, but more than that it carried. Something she could almost understand. Now like the land was breathing Barrett. Crouched near a rock where tracks had been marked in fresh mud, wolves were. Here, he said, yesterday, maybe less. Ellie knelt beside him and traced the paw print with her fingers, and then just, for a moment she saw him a shape between. The trees' amber eyes catching the light. Watching, she didn't speak, didn't wave. Just stood quiet as he turned and moved. Away back into the woods, she knew what. It meant there were still truths hidden. In the wilderness, still dangers, but she wasn't afraid, because somewhere out there Ash was still watching, and the forest was no longer silent. 1 year had passed since that winter night Ella Grayson stumbled from the pines with a pack of wolves at her. Back in Bitter Pine, time moved slow, but not for the valley that bore witness to what most had once called impossible. The snow had melted, seasons turned over, and in the hush that followed public scrutiny, something quieter, deeper had taken root. The research station was no longer a temporary platform hammered into earth between snowmelt and frost. Now it stood as a full structure, simple but sturdy, anchored on the ridge, overlooking the heart of Ash's territory. It had been built not to disturb, but to observe, a shelter of stillness nestled into the land. There were no fences, no cameras that blinked or clicked, just long silent hours behind scopes and scribbled notes a pact of distance held. Steady between human and wild, Ash had grown visibly older, his coat, once the color of shadowed silver and ash dusted stone, was now dulled with age. His gait had slowed, favoring his left side on the steeper inclines, though no injury was recorded. He had not passed his place at the head of the pack. No young blood had overtaken him, though two strong males now ran close at his heels, learning his paths and matching his pauses when the pack moved toward the interaction field, a wide clearing where the wolves sometimes approached the humans they had come to tolerate. It was still Ash who led them. Ellie was 10 now, taller, but not in the rushed, uncertain way some children grow. She moved like the valley had left its rhythm in her bones. Dr. Ruth Hadley, now overseeing the expanded study team, had granted her limited access to the outermost line of the observation ring, a place adults were careful with. But the wolves accepted. Ellie had only to kneel, and the pack would come within range, never too close, but never afraid. Ruth's logs began filling with patterns she hadn't seen in other wolf populations. Every approach to the research zone was preceded by specific behaviors. One wolf always held back, stationed with clear visibility on the higher rock formations. Another circled wide before returning, ears alert and posture tense. A third, always the same lean female, led the others and then waited at the edge until the full group had assembled. Ruth called it instinct at first, but the behavior repeated too often, too precisely. It was structure, roles defined not by domination but by deliberation. Meanwhile, in Denver, Noah Grayson's series When Wolves Protect began to ripple through national discourse. The story of Bitterpines' pack, once dismissed as folklore or the product of rural hysteria, had become a data-backed phenomenon. His articles didn't romanticize, they contextualized. He wrote about the traps the wolves had avoided the patterns they had followed, to flank dangerous zones of deliberate, way they approached the injured and the vulnerable more than once other hikers had reported moments of unexpected safety where a howl redirected their path or a lone wolf shadowed them back to a trail head. Noah didn't call it magic. He called it mutualism, that word. Alone began showing up in policy drafts. Ellie's mother had been reluctant to return to Bitter Pine at first. Too many memories, too many nights clutching at the dark, not knowing whether her daughter would ever emerge again. But Ellie had asked in quietly, firmly had said that not all goodbyes were meant to last forever. When they returned in the spring, it was Ruth who extended the invitation. An international conservation summit was being hosted in Missoula, and Ellie had been requested to speak. The stage was tall, the room vast, filled with voices that shaped laws and built maps. But when Ellie stepped forward, the hush that settled across the auditorium was absolute. She didn't fidget or scan the crowd for comfort. Her voice didn't shake, and she said only what she needed to. They didn't save me because I was special. They saved me because they knew I couldn't save myself. There was no applause at first, just silence, and slowly the room stood, not for the child, not for the story, but for the truth that could no longer be shrugged off as anomaly in Bitter Pine. The research continued, though it had long since stopped being just research. Rangers arrived not with guns, but with data sheets conservation groups brought. Equipment not to trap, but to listen. The valley once charted for development was now marked as sacred ground, phrase rarely used in federal maps, but no one challenged it. And high above it all, ash remained. That evening, Ellie stood by the western ridge where the old pine bent, like a watchman over the slope. She had not come for ceremony, only to see, and from the outcrop, Ash was waiting. He no longer walked with the sureness of his youth, but he stood tall, his chest lifted against the wind, his fur catching the last of the golden light. Behind him, the pack moved larger, now generations laced with his blood, some grayer, some leaner, but all steady. Ellie raised her hand, not as signal or command, but as greeting. Ash didn't move toward her, nor did he retreat. He simply watched the same way he had on that first night in the snow, when she had fallen and he had chosen not to turn away. The wind caught in the trees and carried no sound but breath and the soft crush of paws across dry earth. Ash turned slow and regal and led his pack down toward the valley floor. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They had made their choice, and Bitter Pine would remember